This is a 15-minute video to tell you about a project that we've been working on with 5 pretty bright people over the last year, and in association with East West Institute and our company Red Bison. The 5 people are John Newble, a very bright classmate of mine from the Naval Academy, very accomplished government servant. Dave Walker, another very accomplished government servant. Jim Blaker, an old friend of mine who's been deeply involved as an ambassador level player in the mutual balanced force reductions in the Cold War. Martha Behar, my partner in Red Bison, and her son Sebastian Alfonso, who is a wonderful 17-year-old who will live out the drama of this story. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the 3 major issues that are facing our country, we believe, over the next decades. Those issues are the lack of long-term planning. There is not any sign of long-term planning in our government. We used to talk about the Marshall Plan, man on the moon. It's very hard to find those visions. Anything that we today continue to foster as the elements of our country's future. On the other hand, long-term planning does happen in other countries, and I'll come to that later. The second is the debt of the country. Never been as fragile as it is today. Over 100% debt to GDP. GDP is the measure of the size of companies, the countries, the influence of countries, the ability of trade of countries, the size of militaries, etc. And debt is a factor that is going to affect this country handsomely. Finally, the topic around which this video is done, China-U.S. relationships in the decades ahead. And here, we believe it's very important to see these problems from both sides. The Chinese have many reasons for the way they do things. We should fully understand what those reasons are before we're either critical or supportive. And I see very little of that in our American society, in our media, in our Congress, to see the problem from both sides. In the United States, which I'll cover briefly, we have this large debt. We have substantial demographic problems as we get older, and there are fewer young workers to take care of us old people, especially as we move into the future. Because of the budget challenges and the debt challenges, the discretionary spend in the United States will be more limited. Social Security, welfare programs, Medicare, etc., veterans' pensions will be challenged, as will the military budget, which we believe will be not $700 billion as it is today, but perhaps $400 or $500 billion due to the challenges of the debt. In the United States, we have huge innovation, great opportunity for small companies, for smart ideas, for smart people to innovate, entrepreneurs, heaven in many, many of our cities around the United States. And of course, the education system of our country is unparalleled. We find great universities in every country, but here we find the dearth of universities in every state, in every major city, and we have the great universities that we're all well familiar with. We're lacking that vision of the future and the ability to apply resources to make that vision happen. So I want to now shift to China and talk a little bit more in detail about China. China does have a history of establishing long-term visions. It has been the way the Chinese have always been. And here we have a country that will likely be the largest country in the world by GDP in 2038. If they're not the largest, then they will certainly be side by side with the United States. And for the first time, in our lifetimes, we will see a peer country that is larger than we are. I would ask whether it's best for us to be enemies, whether it's best for us to be spending huge amounts of money and effort to take them on in some kind of strongly alienated way, or whether it's better to be cooperating for peace and security in the world, a world that will be likely much more threatened by terrorism and cyber crime than it is today. Many more non-national terrorist organizations affecting all of us. We will need to take that on by ourselves or take it on with our possibly friends in China for the better interests of our children. So as we look at China and their visions, they have many visions that they've put in place. The Belt and Road Initiative to integrate 65 countries of Asia and South Asia, high-speed rail running from Beijing to Warsaw. They talk about tunnels which go underneath the Himalaya mountains, and they're funding many of these things.
It's 2013, and Chinese President Xi Jinping is giving a speech in Kazakhstan, where he mentions the ancient Silk Road, a network of trade routes that spread goods, ideas, and culture across Europe, the Middle East, and China as far back as 200 BC. He then says,
"We should take an innovative approach and jointly build an economic belt along the Silk Road."
A month later, Xi is in Indonesia.
The two sides should work together to build up a new maritime road in the 21st century.
These two phrases were the first mentions of Xi's legacy project, the multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. They're also the two components of the plan. There's an overland economic belt of 6 corridors that serve as new routes to get goods in and out of China, like this railroad connecting China to London, and these gas pipelines from the Caspian Sea to China, and a high-speed train network in Southeast Asia. Then there's the Maritime Silk Road, a chain of seaports stretching from the South China Sea to Africa that also directs trade to and from China. The BRI also includes oil refineries, industrial parks, power plants, mines, and fiber optic networks, all designed to make it easier for the world to trade with China. So far, over 60 countries have reportedly signed agreements for these projects. And the list is growing because China promotes it as a win-win for everyone.
Belt and Road is being funded across these 65 countries, and it does increase the influence of China, the trade of China, the opportunity for China to be seen as a partner country. We would question whether we should at least investigate whether that is something we should be involved with. We see the Made in China Initiative 2025, an initiative that deals with increasing consumerism in China and especially opening up government services, but also bringing great technologies to the marketplace for things that are made there, for the products and services that are provided there, for the Chinese people and also for export. We see the Asian Import Investment Bank, and that's a bank that's established and led by China to provide loans to developing countries to help them in their growth. That increases the influence as well. We have many criticisms of the way they do that. However, they are doing it, they're putting the money there, they are influencing these countries, and we need to be quite aware of why they do it. I believe they do it because of their national interest, and we need to understand what's going on with the Asia Investment Bank. And finally, I just mentioned the Artificial Intelligence Initiative, an initiative to make China #1 in the world in artificial intelligence, an initiative that was established by the President of China, President Xi Jinping, during the 19th Party Congress in November of 2017.
schooling the country's top research talent and enhancing technology. China's first artificial intelligence treatment center.
It seems now the whole world can't stop talking about fourth industrial revolution, which is fast approaching with rapid breakthroughs in fields such as the Internet of Things, robots, artificial intelligence, and 3D printing. So how fast are robotic technologies developing in China?
In less than 15 years, Xiaosong or Xingsong in Chinese has grown from nothing to China's largest robot company. Its products range from industrial robots to service robots as demand in China has ramped up. Industry 4.0 wouldn't squeeze out human jobs, but will help combine personalized demand.
These initiatives are enormously important in terms of the way they see the world, and they also look at the future of their political system, socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Each of those words has a meaning to it. We should understand those words. It's not just propaganda. It's also an attempt to look at what the future of their government will be, which President Xi Jinping has said is socialism and much broader democracy for the people of China as they move forward in education and in the growth of their economy and bringing the poor out of that category. The Chinese are faced with the same kind of demographic problem we have. They're getting older as a society. There will be fewer workers to take care of the older generation, and that's going to be a problem for them because they don't have many of the same systems we have established. They will be faced with border challenges for the rest of their history, as will we face terrorism. They will face it on their borders. They face terrorism, cybersecurity around the 17 nations, and the border challenges are significant. They have 4 or 5 today that are immediate concern to them. They've been concerned about maintaining their domestic border for 1,000 years, and that concern continues. I would say if we were in their shoes, we would probably be concerned for the same reason. The military is going to change radically. They have downsized it. They have made it much smarter. They have made it joint. They have joint commands. They've downsized the number of commands in their country in an effort to try to bring greater and greater efficiency. And they're much more focused on joint warfighting, which makes total sense in the full efficiency of how you spend the money and how you make your forces efficient. They're implementing artificial intelligence in many different ways, robotics, machine learning into their military. It is a national prerogative that has been driven by the President of China, who is also the chairman of the Central Military Commission. They are looking at non-symmetric ways of looking at warfare. That means that if we are doing carriers and submarines and airplanes, they may be looking not so much at that, they are looking at that of course, but also at the weaknesses of other countries' systems and focusing on those non-symmetric areas of warfare. Finally, they're looking at growing international presence. They know that as a great nation, they will need to have trade, they'll need to take on piracy, they'll need to be working with the United Nations on humanitarian disaster and peacekeeping, and they're doing that by building a larger navy and looking at oceans as a dominant element of their future military. We see that in their efforts in peacekeeping in the United Nations today, where they are very large in their contribution to UN peacekeeping in the world. And finally, we see them very concerned about terrorism on their borders with the Uyghurs and many of the challenges of the stands. And we too will face those same terrorist issues, and it's another area for cooperation. Now, the question is, what should we do in 2018 to address these factors in the way the world will look in 2038? What are the elements that we will put in place to avoid a new form of Cold War, to avoid Graham Allison's Thucydides trap, which portends to show that if you have two great nations in the world, they will become enemies? What can we do to protect ourselves from that? We need to be looking for means of collaboration, means of finding a way forward with the Chinese, not just taking them on as enemies, but looking for possibilities where we could find ways to work together. We are both peers in 2038. We're both strong. We're equal size, or they're possibly a little larger. Same budget, same percentage of GDP for the military. This will be a very different looking world in 2038 than it does today. And together we need to be both addressing peacekeeping, terrorism, humanitarian disasters, finding ways to move forward together to make a difference in a very, very difficult world. We have 9 possible recommendations. These are purely that, recommendations. They are thought out. We think that they make sense. Let me just briefly list them. We think that the Northeast Asia region will continue to foster many issues. Today we have the issues of Taiwan, the Senkaku Islands, we have the South China Sea, of course, and we have the 5 nations of Northeast Asia, that is the Russians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and of course ourselves, the Americans, who are very involved in Northeast Asia. There is no discussion forum for this region, and yet there will be continuing issues ranging from accidents to possible wars in these areas. We need to have a place, something perhaps like the OSCE in Europe, where we can come together routinely as nations and talk about and deal with these issues. This is not a defense alliance, it's an alliance for peace and security in the region. We think that there's something to be said about investigating a free trade zone between the United States and China, no tariffs on either side. Evaluate that and see what that looks like. There are many very wise people in this country and in China who thinks that's a very good idea, and so do we. We think not only good for America and for China, but also for the other nations of the world. We think that there's room for a commitment of no first use of cyber attack. This would set a precedent for other nations to take up the same idea, and we think no first use of cyber is something we could do, we could look at today. The 4th item is a collaboration for peace in the most troubled countries in the world, perhaps North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. Here we have much to offer together in terms of sanctions, in terms of peacekeeping forces, in terms of pressures, in terms of verification, in the case of North Korea, for example. And here this partnership could be profound. We think we should review the international organizations of the world, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods Agreement with the Chinese for this new world. This will be a new world. We should look at the provisions of these treaties that are now 80 years old, and which we should be looking at as an element of going forward and making them as strong as they can be, and perhaps adding additional world organizations that can be equally useful. We think that we need to find a way to agree with the Chinese that we continue to provide the nuclear umbrella over Japan and South Korea. This is for the better interests of the Chinese. It's for the better interests of the world that Japan and South Korea do not develop nuclear weapons. They don't today, even though they're very capable of doing that, because the United States is there providing that nuclear umbrella. And we need to find a way to do that in the spirit of Chinese understanding that we're doing it and that we are there with those allies, at the same time opening the door to a new kind of collaboration with China. We think that people-to-people programs are very important, and here the thought about students in both countries. They have 275,000 in the United States today. We have far, far fewer in China. Educational, people-to-people, military people-to-people, tourists, business. How do we open those doors? And we think it's worthwhile to look at the possibility of putting a collaboration between the U.S. and China through Vice President Pence today, and Li Keqiang, the Premier of China, leading the charge to put in place these kind of programs as an enduring effort between our two countries. In all of this, we have to get our financial house in order, and here, unless we get our debt under control, even these kind of things will not look possible. The debt to GDP is estimated to be much higher than 100% in 2038. This will take over eventually the thoughts of the next generation and will change the whole setting for all of the things I've talked about. There are a little more outrageous ideas, ideas that deal with the fact that we have in 2038, with satellites and UAVs and all kinds of sensors, we and the Chinese will have a very good picture of what is going on every spot on the surface of the Earth and perhaps underwater in the world's oceans in a way that we couldn't imagine today. If that's true, maybe we need to collaborate to open up those borders of the oceans and the space of the world, so that we'll know where the terrorists are, so we'll know where the cyber issues might be, so that we'll be able to deal with peacekeeping, humanitarian disaster in a much more sophisticated way. It's perhaps outrageous, but maybe we should talk to the Chinese about using those bases in the South China Sea, the very large base, 4 square miles in size, as an international place for peacekeeping and humanitarian uses, but not for military uses. There is an opportunity there to do something with them that might be profound in terms of settling the issues of the South China Sea. I know how contentious those are, but those last two items are ideas that at least we should come to grips with to see if there's something there. So our thrust in all of this is to say, let's start to talk about this. Those things that make sense, let's drive policy before it's too late. It will look too late if we don't do something between now and 2038. The Thucydides trap is upon us. Let's take a hold, let's understand, let's get out and play in the arena. Let's do something that matters. Let's not be afraid of ideas. Let's not be afraid of what our friends on either side of the political spectrum will think of us. Let's do something. Thank you for listening to this video, and I hope you take it in the spirit in which it's intended, from someone who cares enormously and deeply about our country and our next generations. Thank you for listening.